Jesus came to change the world, and for nothing less than that. Sometimes we may have the idea, or I know I perhaps had at times as a child, that Jesus came into the world so that I could be dragged to church and be bored. And sometimes that's essentially the concept of our religion. Well, I have to go or be dragged to catechism class or go to church and be bored. But that this doesn't really have anything to do with the rest of my life. But of course, that is not our faith at all. Our faith is that Jesus came to change the world, to transform the world. And that's part of what we remember in this feast of Christ the King. The idea of the kingship of the Lord, first of all, of my own life. That if Christ is truly Lord and King of my life, well, maybe that affects what I do for an hour in the morning on Sundays, but sometimes we live as if, but that doesn't have anything else to do with anything else in my life, the real stuff of life. But again, that's not our Christian faith. If Christ is really truly Lord and King of my life, that means that who he is, what he did, what he teaches, affects every aspect of who I am. Every area of my life is meant to be transformed by his kingship. The idea of his kingdom coming into my life is me living as a member of the kingdom. That means every aspect of my life is ordered by his kingship, by his kingdom. How I spend my time, how I treat others in relationships, both in personal relationships and professional work relationships. How I use my money. How I engage with the civil order of society, and so on. That all of this is meant to be ordered by the gospel. That my life is being transformed, that there's no area in my life that is not transformed and affected by the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is why the church gives us so much teaching on so many areas, to help us understand, how does this come to bear on my life? What does this thing that Jesus did and said and taught, and his death on the cross 2,000 years ago, what does this have to do with the daily grind of life here and now? Well, frankly, everything. But it's not just my own personal life to be transformed, but it's also that, as I started to say, that if we really believe that the Christ is Lord, then this kingship, this kingdom, carries over in how we engage in society, in politics even. That there's an assumption from the founding fathers of this nation that the members of this society would be shaped and formed by their faith, by Christianity especially, that would form them as virtuous, moral human beings that would therefore then affect the order of society. If we're, as the founding fathers thought, if we're building a society that is sort of ruled by the voice of the people, and the assumption is that we need something else that's forming the people to be good, upstanding, virtuous, moral people. John Adams, the second president of the United States, wrote this very idea. He wrote in a letter to some government officials that we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, gallantry, these would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. At the assumption of the founding fathers, especially when they talked about the separation of church and state was, well, the idea is that the government would not impose a national religion. But it did assume that people would be formed by their religion, and that would therefore affect the civil order. That people would be shaped and formed as individuals morally, in virtue, in their faith. So it's not the assumption that there's no effect either way, but in fact it assumes that the civil order would be affected by the moral teachings of Christianity. And furthermore, that it's also a two-way street, that we're called by our faith to work for a more just society, to build a society where, as the one Catholic radical Peter Morin once said, to build a society where it's easier for people to be good. That it's a two-way street. How we order society can help us to be more moral and virtuous people, make it easier to make good and just decisions. Because, of course, when people are oppressed or in poverty, in desperate situations, many times that is where, breaking the law happens, where crime happens. So to build a society where it's easier for people to be good, says Peter Morin. So you can see the kingship of the Lord has this two-way street, both affecting me, how I order my life as an individual that has influence on society, but that we're also then called to order society to make it easier for people to be moral and just and good. And it was that idea in mind that this feast was established. That Christ's kingship not just affects our hearts as individuals, but has an effect on the moral order. Literally transforms the world to make the world better. Pope Pius XI established this feast in the 1920s, specifically because he had seen the world ravaged by war in the greatest war the world had ever seen, that which was World War I. And on top of that, he was living post the Industrial Revolution, before there were a lot of human rights established for factory workers yet. So he saw a lot of oppression, or these people living in horrible working conditions as well. So watching the world be people being oppressed, the rights not being respected, and watching the world be torn apart by war, after World War I, he established this feast with the hope and prayer that it would remind people to again work for true justice in society, to remember who is truly the greatest sovereignty, King and Lord. That the highest good is not my own nation, my own ethnic group, or my particular political group, but the highest sovereignty, the highest power is Christ the King. This Lord who came down to give his life for others, to lay down his life for others, to establish forgiveness, reconciliation, and therefore peace. To teach the importance of responsibility for my fellow human being. That I'm not merely responsible for my own good, looking out for number one, but that in fact, while that both there are inherent human rights to every individual because we are made in the image and likeness of God, and simultaneously we have responsibility for the good of others. That am I my brother's keeper? And the Christian faith says, yes. That I have a call and a responsibility to be a force of good in the world, and to strive for peace, and to recognize that when we harbor resentment and bitterness, both as individuals and on the communal level, it only leads to violence. This was one of the Catholicism's and Pope Pius XI and other popes' great critique of Marxism that they saw, that led to communism, is while they sympathize with the oppression of peoples and with the poor, as Marxism did, the great critique was that Marxism was essentially built not so much on love for the poor, but on resentment for those who held power that would only lead to terrible violence and oppression of human rights, which all you have to do is to read a history book and see how it has. So we remember on this day that Christ came to change the world, that Christ is King. And so how do I allow him to be truly Lord of my own life as an individual? And how do I allow that to shape my member how I live as a member, as a citizen of this society? To work for justice, for care for the poor, to build a society where it's easier for people to be good. This is the social reign. This is the kingship of Jesus Christ, that we're called by him, not just to shape our own lives, but with him to transform the world. Amen.